The moment I pressed my pen against the paper, the entire boardroom froze. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the air itself turned to glass. Fragile, cold, and about to shatter. My signature was supposed to finalize the biggest merger in our company's history, but instead, it became the spark that exposed everything. People often say you can feel when you're standing on the edge of something life-changing. They're right. I felt it in the weight of that pen, in the way my hand trembled, in the quiet hum of the ceiling lights above. Every instinct screamed that something wasn't right, but by then, it was too late to walk away unnoticed. The wolves were already watching. Just a few months earlier, I'd been promoted, the youngest director of compliance our firm had ever appointed. My job was to review merger contracts, ensure every clause passed legal and ethical scrutiny, and safeguard the company's reputation. On paper, it sounded noble. In reality, it meant cleaning up after powerful men who thought rules were for the weak. The CEO, Richard Hale, was one of them. To the public, he was a visionary, the man who turned Hale Capital from a mid-tier investment firm into a billion-dollar empire. But behind closed doors, his charm had cracks. I'd seen flashes of his temper, the sharpness behind his smiles. Still, I never imagined the empire itself was built on something rotten. When I was first handed the merger file, labeled Confidential Meridian Integration, I remember the subtle tremor in my boss's voice. "Just sign off when ready," he said, sliding the folder across my desk. The CEO wants this pushed through by Friday. At first glance, everything looked clean. The numbers aligned, the valuations were solid, and the due diligence reports were immaculate. Almost too immaculate. Perfect pages make my instincts itch, because in finance, perfection isn't real. It's manufactured. I began digging deeper, running quiet audits late into the night. Most people left the office by 8 p.m., but I stayed, the only light on the 23rd floor flickering through the glass tower. My reflection stared back at me as I flipped through line items that didn't add up. Shell subsidiaries that had appeared overnight, and capital transfers routed through anonymous trusts. The deeper I looked, the more the pattern emerged, a hidden loop of offshore accounts funneling money through an entity linked to Meridian's board. On paper, it was a merger. In truth, it was money laundering disguised as corporate expansion. My heart sank when I found the signature block. Richard Hale's name, bold and clean. Below it, mine, pre-filled and digitized, waiting for my confirmation. They hadn't just expected me to approve it. They'd prepared my name in advance. That was the moment I understood. I wasn't being promoted, I was being positioned. My compliance stamp was their cover, my reputation their shield. If the deal ever went south, I'd be the one holding the pen. I still remember the night I confronted my reflection in the office window, whispering, "They think I won't notice." My pulse hammered like war drums in my chest. The city lights glittered below. Beautiful, distant, indifferent. I could have walked away, signed it blindly, and cashed my bonus like everyone else. No one would have known. But the truth changes you once you see it. It eats at you, whispers in the quiet, reminds you of who you used to be, before compromise became survival. I thought about my father, an accountant who lost everything when his boss framed him for embezzlement. I thought about the way he said, "Never let your silence make you guilty." So I didn't. I stayed quiet on the outside, playing the loyal employee, but inside I started building a plan, one signature at a time. When the final board meeting arrived, the tension was palpable. The room gleamed with money, tailored suits, silver pens, and eyes that measured worth in profit margins. Richard stood at the head of the table, all charisma and control, smiling like the world already belonged to him. He looked at me when he said, "Once you sign Amelia, this merger will make history." The board applauded. Cameras flashed. I smiled back, steady, polite, unreadable. They had no idea that the file in front of me wasn't the one they'd sent for signing. I'd switched it 2 days earlier. The document I was about to sign wasn't the final merger agreement. It was a whistleblower disclosure, legally binding, time-stamped, and addressed directly to the Federal Regulatory Authority. One stroke of my pen would expose everything. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, and the false valuations, so I signed. The sound of that pen scratching across the paper was like thunder in my ears. The room didn't know yet. Not Richard, not the board, not the lawyers smiling for the cameras. But I knew, in that single moment, the empire began to crack. And as I slid the paper forward with a calm smile, I thought to myself, this is how you end a kingdom. Not with noise, but with a signature. The day after the signing, the office felt still. Too still. The kind of silence that hums beneath the surface, where everyone pretends nothing has changed, but something has, and no one dares name it. I sat at my desk that morning, a cup of black coffee cooling beside my keyboard, staring at my reflection in the glossy surface of my screen. My face looked calm, but my mind was running laps. The signature was done. The disclosure had been transmitted. There was no undoing it now. Every sound seemed sharper. The click of keyboards, the buzz of printers, the distant murmur of voices from the executive wing. Each noise reminded me that somewhere above me, Richard Hale was probably shaking hands, smiling for the press, celebrating his historic deal. But underneath those smiles, the ground was shifting. By mid-morning, emails were flying faster than usual. Legal was cross-verifying documents. Compliance was reconfirming clearance. And Richard's assistant was sending unusually vague meeting invites. I could almost feel the panic beginning to ripple. Quiet, invisible, but real. At noon, I received one of those invites myself. Dinner with the CEO. Private celebration. Tonight, 8 p.m., I stared at it for a long time. Richard wasn't the kind of man who celebrated with people. He celebrated in front of them. Which meant this dinner wasn't a reward. It was an evaluation. He wanted to look me in the eye. To read the truth between my smiles. I showed up anyway. The restaurant was small and quiet, all dark wood and low lights. I arrived early, rehearsing my expression in the polished silverware. Calm, polite, nothing more. When Richard finally entered, calm, polite, nothing more. When Richard finally entered, he carried that same aura of control. The air of a man who believed the world existed to bend for him. He poured wine, raised his glass, and said, "To loyalty?" I clinked my glass gently. My smile practiced. "To the future," I replied. He studied me over the rim of his glass. "You didn't hesitate yesterday. That's rare. Most people flinch before a deal that big." I shrugged lightly. The numbers made sense. "Good," he said, leaning back. "I like people who don't overthink. Overthinking breeds fear. Fear breeds mistakes." The way he said it felt deliberate, like a knife pressed softly against the skin, testing for weakness. I held his gaze, unflinching. He shifted gears after that, talking about growth, expansion, legacy. But every word felt rehearsed. He wasn't talking to celebrate. He was talking to distract himself. Deep down, he already knew something was off. Men like Richard could smell risk long before they saw it. Halfway through dessert, my phone buzzed. A discreet vibration against my lap. I glanced down. A notification from my encrypted inbox. Disclosure received. Investigation in process. My pulse spiked. I kept my face still, nodding as Richard continued to talk about profit margins and market share, pretending I was still listening. But my mind was miles away, picturing the chain reaction I'd just set off. The regulators would be reviewing everything within hours. The audit trail was airtight. Every transaction, every hidden account, every falsified valuation. When dinner ended, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "You've got potential, Amelia," he said softly. "Stay close to the right people and you'll go far." I smiled. I planned to. That night, as I stepped into the cold air outside, I exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. The city around me glowed with indifferent light. Towers built on ambition and illusion. I wondered how many of them hid stories like ours. Back in the office the next morning, I could feel the shift. Legal teams whispering in corridors. Finance heads double-checking files that were already signed, and through the glass walls of the 25th floor. Richard's figure, pacing, phone pressed to his ear, movements sharper than usual. The investigation had begun, and he could sense it. He called a sudden all-hands meeting at noon. His tone was confident, his posture impeccable, but his eyes gave him away. "We've received a few inquiries," he said, smiling tightly. "Just routine oversight. Nothing out of place, lies, smooth as silk." But when his gaze landed on me, it lingered for a second too long. Cold. Curious. Calculating. As people filed out of the room, I heard his voice behind me. Quiet. Almost casual. "Someone's been talking," he said. "And when I find out who, they'll regret it." I walked away without a word, heart thundering in my chest. The game had begun, and this time, the stakes weren't just corporate. They were personal. From that moment on, every day at the office felt like walking through glass. The walls were transparent, but the truth hid in the reflections. Smiles became sharper. Conversation stopped when I entered the room. And Richard, he watched everything. The investigation was still confidential, but rumors had begun to stir. Anonymous questions were being sent to compliance. External auditors were suddenly visiting. Each morning brought new whispers about missing funds, falsified documents, and senior executives quietly calling their lawyers. And yet no one dared to say Richard's name. He, of course, played the part of the untouchable. He carried himself with even greater arrogance than before, pretending nothing was wrong, hosting investor meetings, giving interviews about the next great leap in corporate growth. But behind those press smiles, I saw the tension, the subtle twitch of his jaw, the way his assistant looked terrified to even breathe wrong. It wasn't long before he called me in. His office was quiet when I entered. Too quiet. The blinds were half drawn, slicing sunlight across the glass desk. He gestured for me to sit, not looking up from the file in front of him. "Do you know what betrayal smells like, Amelia?" he asked softly. My heartbeat faltered. "Excuse me." He looked up then, calm, smiling. But his eyes were cold steel. "It smells like fear, and lately this office reeks of it." I stayed silent. He slid a document toward me. A printout of internal audit queries. These questions didn't come from outside. Someone inside compliance leaked information to the regulators. He waited, watching my face. I forced my expression to remain unreadable. "If someone did," I said carefully, "then maybe they found something worth looking at." His smile didn't falter. "That's what worries me. You've always been so thorough." He leaned back, his tone softening like a trap being set. "If you know anything, now's the time to tell me." Before things get messy, for a moment, I met his gaze and saw exactly what he was. A man who believed the rules bent around him. But I also saw something else. Fear, not of exposure yet, but of losing control. I stood slowly. "If there's something to worry about, Richard," I said, my voice steady, "I'm sure the regulators will find it." He laughed under his breath. A quiet, dangerous sound. "You're smarter than I thought," he murmured. "That's good. Just remember, smart people survive by knowing when to stop asking questions." I left his office without another word. My palms damp, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. He knew. Maybe not completely, but enough to make my life difficult. By evening, my access to several internal databases had been revoked for maintenance. My calendar filled with unexpected performance reviews. HR began sitting in on my team meetings, taking notes that didn't make sense. It was subtle, surgical, the kind of professional isolation that destroys reputations without a single accusation. And through it all, Richard kept smiling. But what he didn't know was that the investigators had already reached out privately. They'd confirmed receipt of my evidence, requested further documentation, and begun cross-referencing internal transaction logs. The walls around him were closing in, slowly, quietly, but relentlessly. The more pressure he applied to silence me, the louder the truth grew behind the scenes. Late one night, as I sat alone on the 23rd floor, I looked out over the city, lights flickering like static, and realized something chilling. Richard wasn't just fighting to save his company. He was fighting to save himself, and men like him didn't lose gracefully. The storm was coming. I could feel it in the air. Electric, inevitable. And I knew the next move he'd make wouldn't be corporate. It would be personal. The first knife came quietly. Disguised as a compliment, a week after that tense meeting in Richard's office, an internal memo went out. Effective immediately, Amelia Cross will transition to a supporting role during the merger audit to ensure transparency and neutrality. Transparency. Neutrality. The words looked noble in print, but everyone knew what it meant. I'd been sidelined, removed from my own department under the guise of ethics. My inbox exploded with polite condolences disguised as corporate professionalism. Temporary reassignment, they said. Nothing personal. But in a world like ours, nothing was ever temporary. And everything was personal. Still, I smiled, thanked them all, and played along. Let them believe I was defeated, because the best way to hide power is to let people think you've lost it. Richard made sure to twist the knife deeper. The following Monday, he personally introduced my replacement, a senior compliance officer named Julia Trent, handpicked by him. She'd worked under his wing for years, the kind of loyal shadow who knew when to stay silent. Amelia's taking a step back to focus on internal coordination. Richard announced to the team, Julia will handle the audit correspondence from now on. I could feel his eyes on me as the room clapped politely. Julia gave me that saccharine smile. The kind people wear when they've been given your chair. Don't worry, she said later in the hallway, her voice soft and sweet. I'll keep you updated. You've done so much already. I returned her smile. But inside, something cold uncoiled. I'd spent months building that case. Tracing every forged signature, every offshore trail, and now the woman. Standing in front of me was being handed the keys to it not to finish the job, but to bury it. The betrayal wasn't surprising, it was expected. What did surprise me, though, was how far Richard was willing to go to erase me. 2 days later, my work computer locked me out. My security badge was downgraded, and when I went to retrieve a few personal files from the archive room, the folder containing my merger notes, gone, deleted from both the system and the backups. Every trace of my audit, every spreadsheet, every timestamp, every link vanished. That's when the fear started to creep in. Not the kind that makes you run, the kind that makes you freeze, because suddenly, you realize how small you are compared to the machine you just challenged. That night, I stayed late again, scouring what little access I still had. And that's when I saw it. A forwarded email chain I was never supposed to see. Julia had sent Richard a summary titled, Containment Update. Her message was brief. Data removal completed. Her access revoked. Preparing internal narrative in case of inquiry. They weren't just covering tracks anymore. They were rewriting the story, painting me as the mistake. The overzealous employee who'd misinterpreted financial data. And that narrative, it was already spreading. HR called me in for clarification the next morning. Their tone was courteous, their smiles rehearsed. We just need to verify some inconsistencies. Rehearsed. We just need to verify some inconsistencies, one of them said, clicking her pen. Some of your reports may have contained misaligned figures, perhaps a misunderstanding, that's how they framed it. Every word, every document I'd built was now being turned against me. They wanted to discredit me before the investigation could surface. When I walked out of that room, my legs felt numb. For the first time, I questioned whether I'd made a fatal mistake. Whether trying to expose Richard had only given him the perfect excuse to destroy me instead. That evening, as I gathered my things, I caught sight of Julia in the glass reflection of the office lobby, whispering to Richard, her hand brushing his arm as she laughed. The realization hit me hard. She wasn't just loyal to him. She was complicit. It all made sense now. The missing files, the perfectly timed access cuts, the controlled narrative. Richard hadn't just built a defense. He'd built an accomplice. I drove home that night in silence, my mind spinning between fear and fury. The city lights blurred through the windshield, like streaks of gold melting into darkness. They thought they'd erased my proof. They thought the story was over. But what they didn't know was that I'd made copies, encrypted backups, hidden outside the company network, files that couldn't be deleted, forged, or rewritten. And as I sat in my apartment, the skyline reflected in the window beside me, I realized something sharp and cold. They'd taken my position, my credibility, my voice, but they hadn't taken the truth. And soon, the truth would take everything from them. I stopped thinking like a whistleblower and started thinking like a strategist. First rule, don't rush. Rage makes mistakes. Precision wins. I sat for hours in the dark, laptop glow painting my face, mapping every player in Richard's web, the board members who owed him favors, the auditors who took his calls, the junior execs who'd been paid in silence. I drew lines between names, accounts, and meetings, until the pattern looked like a trap I could walk people into, or out of. Step 2, build redundancy. Julia and the internal team had deleted the visible files, but I'd anticipated that. My encrypted backups were stored in 3 places: a secure cloud under an assumed identity, a solicitor's escrow I trusted, and a physical drive hidden where only I knew. I made copies of the receipts, the transaction timestamps, the shell company registrations. Every link that tied Meridian to Richard's offshore loop had a paper trail and a mirror copy ready to push if they tried to erase it. Step 3, pick allies quietly. I reached out to one board member who'd been restless for months, a woman who'd lost her father's pension to a shady acquisition years ago. She answered after one message. She didn't care for heroics. She cared for liability. I fed her redacted summaries, just enough to make her stomach drop, not enough to be dangerous. Once she felt the tremor, she agreed to listen to the regulators if they came knocking. That one hesitant ally was worth more than a dozen angry tweets. Step 4, weaponized procedure. Regulators move on documentation, timestamps, and lawful disclosures. I fed the right documents to the right places, in the right order. The disclosure I'd signed wasn't a theatrical reveal. It was a procedural arrow, aimed at the heart of their network, The federal office received the full packet. My escrow lawyer confirmed receipt, and the board member was primed to push for an internal audit when the first inquiries came. No alarms, no leaks. Just the slow, inevitable machine of compliance grinding into motion. Step 5. Control the narrative. Richard would try to rewrite the story, to paint me as reckless or vindictive. So I prepared a concise, unemotional memo for media counsel and a fact sheet for the press. Timelines, screenshots, and verifiable records only. Not gossip, not accusations, evidence. If he tried to gaslight the room, the facts would be louder. Step 6. Contingency. They had Julia, loyalty, and access. I had legal cover and witnesses. If they tried to intimidate me, I'd release to multiple parties at once. Regulators, the board member, and a respected investigative journalist I trusted to handle sensitive corporate stories. It wasn't about drama. It was about redundancy. Make it impossible for all channels to be silenced at once. When the plan was set, I slept for the first time in weeks. Not because I trusted it, but because I'd done everything I could. The rest would be watching the architecture of lies collapse under its own weight. Revenge, I'd learned, wasn't about fury. It was patience, preparation, and the quiet accumulation of proof until even the most polished man could no longer hide behind his suits. The night before the board meeting, the city was drenched in rain, a kind of poetic cleansing before the storm I knew was coming. I sat in my apartment, lights low, laptop open, the evidence folder sitting on my desktop like a loaded weapon. Months of quiet observation, every thread tied neatly. Financial trails, offshore transfers, hidden accounts, all connecting to one man and his loyal inner circle. When I finally shut the laptop, my hands trembled. Not from fear, but anticipation. Tomorrow, the truth would no longer be mine alone. The next morning, the building's marble floors gleamed under harsh fluorescent light. Security guards stood unusually alert near the elevator banks. I could sense the tension. A crackle in the air, like the moment before lightning strikes. When I walked into the boardroom, every face turned. The CEO sat at the head of the table, immaculate as ever. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, there she is," he said smoothly, "our compliance hero. I trust you have good news for us?" I met his gaze and smiled. The kind of calm smile that unnerves people who expect fear. "Actually," I said, setting down a slim folder, "I do." The board members shifted in their seats. The CFO coughed. The head of legal looked down at her papers, already pale. I began to speak, clearly, calmly, methodically. Each document I presented was a nail in the coffin. I laid out the unauthorized wire transfers disguised as consulting fees. The shell companies registered offshore, the falsified valuations that made the merger look legal when it wasn't. The CEO interrupted halfway through, his voice sharp. "This is nonsense," he snapped. "Conspiracy theories from someone who doesn't understand the scale of what we're building." But the chairman cut him off. "Let her finish." That was the moment the balance shifted. I could feel it. The room grew colder, quieter, the kind of silence that carries weight. I clicked the remote and brought up the final document. A digital signature trail from the CEO himself, authorizing a payment to a consultant who didn't exist. The effect was immediate. The chairman's expression froze. The CFO stood muttering under his breath. The CEO's jaw clenched, his mask cracking for the first time. "You went through my private approvals," he hissed, leaning forward. "You violated internal—" "I followed the law," I said softly. "Something you stopped doing a long time ago." For a long moment, no one spoke. The hum of the projector filled the silence. Then the chairman finally said the words I'd been waiting for. "Effective immediately. You're suspended pending investigation." The CEO stood, knocking over his chair. "You can't do this to me." But security was already at the door. His voice echoed down the corridor as they escorted him out, still shouting, still denying. I stayed seated, breathing quietly. My hands were steady now. The evidence was out. The lie was over. For the first time in months, the air in that boardroom felt clean, sharp with the sting of truth. And as I gathered my things, I realized something strange. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt free. The empire he'd built on deceit had fallen, not with an explosion, but with a signature. And for the first time, justice didn't feel like vengeance, it felt like balance. In the weeks that followed, the company became a storm of whispers and investigations. The board ordered an internal audit, regulators launched probes, and news outlets caught wind of the scandal. Headlines called it the merger that was never meant to be. The CEO's fall was swift and merciless. His accounts were frozen. His trusted allies turned on him. The man who once strode through the halls like he owned the air now couldn't even enter the building. Meanwhile, my inbox overflowed, not with threats or accusations, but with quiet thank yous. Anonymous messages from employees who'd suspected something but were too afraid to speak. A few even said my name in meetings, calling me the reason we still have a company left. I didn't seek credit. I kept to my office, finishing reports, attending cleanup meetings, answering regulators' questions with the same calm precision that had gotten me here. But sometimes, when I caught my reflection in the glass walls, I'd see something different. Not the cautious woman who once feared losing her job, but someone who had finally taken control of her own story. One evening, after the chaos began to settle, the chairman stopped by my desk. He looked older, wearier, but his eyes were warm. "You saved us," he said quietly. "You saved this place from becoming his legacy." I smiled faintly. "I didn't do it for the company," I replied. "I did it for the truth." He nodded, as if he understood. And maybe he did. When he walked away, I shut down my computer, packed my bag, and stepped into the cool night air. For the first time in months, the city lights didn't feel heavy. They felt alive. I knew things would change. They always do, but for once I wasn't running from the fallout. I was walking towards something new, something earned. Looking back now, I realized the real battle wasn't against the CEO, or even the corruption he tried to bury. It was against silence. The quiet compliance that lets power rot from the inside out. Exposing him cost me more than anyone knew. Friends distanced themselves, promotions were quietly redirected, and there were nights I questioned if I'd done the right thing. But every time doubt crept in, I'd remember the day I saw him escorted out, the shock in the eyes of those who thought no one would ever stand up to him. That memory reminded me why truth, no matter how inconvenient, is worth the risk. The company rebuilt itself slowly, with stricter oversight, new leadership, and a renewed sense of integrity. My name never made the papers, and I preferred it that way. I didn't need fame, just peace. Sometimes, when I pass the old boardroom, I still hear echoes of that day. The click of the projector, the stunned silence, the sound of justice finally catching up. And I smile, because it wasn't revenge that drove me, it was clarity. In the end, one signature destroyed a corrupt empire. But it also set me free. This is revenge untold, where truth cuts deeper than betrayal, and every lie finds its reckoning.